So we'll go and get started with a prayer. So Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and Almighty Father, we thank you for this day as we come just celebrate our nation's Independence Day. Help us to hear what you have to say about the church and the state, how we work together, how we are separated, what the authority is and both, where they lie, who takes precedent. We ask this through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
Yeah, so it's a funny thing about separation of church and state that this really has always been a tradition of the church that's been held really since the very beginning. Sam might have heard this a little bit. I mean, Dr. Madden talked about this a little bit in the church history portion of the RCA program, right? And so we have quite a blessing having Dr. Madden here, being able to teach that section, and he's going to do it again this year, praise God. Really, when we look at this issue of the church and state, we kind of see the roots of it all the way from the very beginning, all the way up through the salvation history. The church and the state have always been like one, right? So any civilization has really been around since the very beginning. There's always been more theocracy, right? So usually the king is also a priest of some kind. We see that really in Genesis with Melchizedek, right? This priest king of Salem, who we don't know where he came from or even if he died. He's only mentioned one time in Genesis. We hear him in the Psalms again with David, but we never hear from him again. And so he's called the priest king, and that's why Abraham gave him a tenth of everything that he won in his defeat of the Amorites. So it's an interesting scenario that we see it all through all these different courses of history, even like the ancient civilizations of like Egypt. So while the Pharaoh is not only the leader of the nation, he's also a god, right? And so he is given due reverence as both. The Greeks, usually they have these oracles, but it's a little more different with the Greeks just because they have these city-states, so there's kind of not necessarily like a unified ruler, but Alexander the Great was almost kind of the point of deification, right? They held him with such piety that they would erect certain maybe monuments to him, or even altars. Even in the Roman Empire, the Caesar was determined to be a god, right? He was the presence of the deity on earth for the Roman people, who were very pious people. Even the Israelites, right? And when we see the foundation of the Israelite people coming out of Egypt into the Holy Land, well, they were led by these judges who were appointed by God, right? And then eventually the kings who were appointed by God, and even with people like David, who was also considered to be a priest as well. And there's a question like where his priesthood come from, right? But even before that time of Moses, Aaron was kind of the high priest, but also kind of with Moses was the ruler of the people, right? They were always being guided by this kind of theocratic leader. Time of Jesus, we have these Pharisees and Sadducees who were of the high priestly class, right? And they were also considered to be the secular rulers of the people. And we see that really all up to about the 4th century. When it comes to the church, Jesus established his church with the apostles. They were the leaders of the church, but they didn't really have any secular authority, right? I mean, they didn't really like rule any lands. There was nothing like that. They lived basically in common, which meant that basically they would stay in people's homes and they would share everything they had as a gift of charity, especially to those who needed it. But there was really no like secular ruler, right? There was a head that was kind of worked in conjunction with the body, which was basically the first college of cardinals, right? With the apostles. But there was, even though Peter was the head, he didn't really have authority over secular matters, right? He had no army, right? There was nothing like there to actually rule. So it's kind of fascinating that's how the church kind of starts. It didn't start with any secular authority. It was all purely a spiritual movement that was governed through human instruments, of course, but the thought was going back to the time of the judges in Israel that, well, God's our king. He's the one that leads us, right? We are all just representatives of him on earth, but he's our leader. He's our head. And that's kind of how the church operated all the way till about the 4th century. So what happened in the 4th century, of course, we all know. No, we don't. Constantine. So we had this battle of the Milvian Bridge, right? And there was an appearance in the sky of this, the Cairo, the Greek letters for the first two letters of the word Christ, and in the sky with the sign in signo vincebis. So in the sign you in the sign you will conquer, right? So Constantine decided to put that emblem along with the pagan emblem of the sun god, because he also was a sun worshiper, on his shields, and he went into battle and he won. And so this happened in 315 AD. And so because of that, I'm sorry, 313 AD. Because of that, he decided then to allow Christianity to actually be a religion. So before that, it was outlawed, right? From the time of Nero, which happened in 64 AD, Christianity was outlawed because of the fire that was destroyed part of Rome. It was blamed on the Christians. Whether actually Nero started the fire or was an accident, either way, he needed a scapegoat. The Christians seemed like a pretty convenient scapegoat to have because they were relatively new. And also they kind of posited some kind of challenge to his authority. They didn't recognize the Roman gods, which in reality probably that big of a deal because the Romans kind of had this more freedom of religion in their society. That's one of the reasons why they allowed the Hebrews to actually practice their religion. They really recognized any religion was something of God, and so therefore it should be reverenced and venerated. But because of this, they decided that Christianity was the exception, and so they outlawed Christianity throughout the entire empire because of Nero. And all through the next 200 years has been this fluctuation of kind of these great persecutions, and there's some people like kind of indifference to Christianity, so it kind of flourished a little bit. And you had these kind of waves and waxes and wanes of these kind of great persecutions, and kind of was like, okay, well, we'll let them go. It's fine, not a big deal. We're gonna kind of turn a blind eye, even though it is outlawed. Whatever you do in the private of your own home, fine, whatever, right? Until Constantine took the throne in 313 from the Battle of Milvian Bridge. He allowed Christianity, he actually basically de-outlawed it, I guess, for lack of a better word. And then people could start practicing. Now, he didn't make it the state religion. It's very important to point that out, right? They were still pagans. There were still these other religions that were going on in the ancient Roman Empire, but Christianity now was one of them that would be allowed to actually be practiced by the people. And from that, it kind of really flourished. It kind of took hold. It was believed that Constantine took the faith, but he was really more of an Arian bent. So the Arians were kind of this sect that didn't recognize the divinity of Christ. They thought that Jesus was a created being, but he was like one of the highest created beings, right? He was the highest. He was the epitome of humanity, but he was not at the point of divinity, right? He didn't share that nature with God, which was also recognized and debunked in the Council of Nicaea in 325, which, coincidentally enough, was an interesting point because that's really when the church took up this mantle of separation of church and state. And the reason is because Constantine wanted to get a council together from all the bishops of the world because of this question of, okay, there's all these different people who claim to be Christian. They have all these different ideas about the Trinity and different ideas about who Jesus was, and these different ideas about, what was been handed down by tradition. Some think there's some special knowledge that was given by Jesus to his apostles, and he had to be like a secret, super secret coded society in order to actually receive this knowledge. And so we want to get some answers here. So I want to call this council together. And that's fine, but the problem is the emperor had no authority to actually call council, right? But he did work hand in hand with the Pope, and was kind of the main drive behind getting together and actually having the Council of Nicaea. So all the bishops of the world got together. They started debating these different aspects of these ideas with Arian and Gnostics and all these different kind of heresies that kind of were popping up over the 300. They couldn't really be debated because, well, we were a church in exile. We couldn't really kind of get together and debate these things. And they came up with these series of teachings and dogmas that we hold true today, even 1,700 years later. Primarily on what the Trinity is. These at least two divine persons. Nicaea basically came out and said, yeah, we at least know that Jesus is God. So the Arians, shut up, you're wrong. We debated this, we figured it out. Yeah, Jesus is God. It's pretty clear in scripture, it's pretty clear in apostolic tradition. Great. Then there was a movement to kind of look at the liturgy, right? So how are we going to celebrate, the Mass? How are we going to do the sacraments, right? What should we use for the scripture readings for the Mass, right? So let's get this whole thing, let's get a book, Bible, with all the books that we're going to use in the liturgy, and what would be some good criteria to develop that. And so that was all. And then also we probably should actually come up with a creed so we can actually differentiate ourselves in other sects. Maybe we don't necessarily believe what the Catholic Church believes. We can actually differentiate and maybe call out heresy when we see it, right? And so all that was done in 325 for the next like maybe decade, right? So the councils usually take a while because first you have to get everyone together, then you have to debate these issues. It goes back and forth. And then they have documents written up, they're revised, they're re-revised, they go to the Pope for his signature, and then finally they're promulgated, right? And then the council would come to a close. And that all happened. And one of the things that came out of the Council of Nicaea was, we have to have some clear guidelines between what the state's authority is and what the church's authority is, right? So there should be a separation of church and state because we don't want the secular authorities telling us how to worship and maybe influence the way what God is telling us to do, which can cause problems. And really, we shouldn't be involved in like how to like raise an army or how to, what taxes should be imposed on people or, all these other things that a secular ruler would do, right? So we shouldn't really have that. That's not really our purview. So let's be clear about the separation and understand who does what, right? So from the very early days, the church has always upheld this understanding of, first off, freedom of religion, but also as the separation of church and state for a good reason, right? So that the church isn't influenced in a negative way away from the faith, but also that the church should be involved in certain things that it shouldn't be involved in, right? So it's actually great wisdom to kind of do that. Now, throughout history, though, was it always practiced? Well, the church always upheld that, right? That was always the ideal. That was always the practice of the church to keep those things separate. The emperor had this purview, the pope had their purview. Over time, the emperor tried to influence more of the pope, right? Even though most of the emperors were Catholic or Christian in some form, whether it be through an Arian or some heretical sect. There was one time where there was really shortly after Constantine, where a pagan took the throne, but was more open to the Christianity, and actually eventually even converted, which is interesting too. So there's always been this kind of this tug of war, this tension between the secular ruler and the church, right? And that kind of took a step further after the fall of Rome. So Rome, over time, once the capital of Rome moved from Rome to Constantinople, right, in Turkey, instead of kind of two separate empires, you had the Eastern Empire, the Western Empire. They were both ruled by an emperor or Augustan. And typically they were kind of in conjunction with each other. And then every once in a while, someone would want to take control of the other, blah, 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 how that all goes with those type of things. But the church was always kind of just present there, right? It didn't really take sides in these issues. Like, well, that's a thing you guys can figure out yourself. Is this person, is there an unjust aggression going on here? So they would definitely help direct and counsel if need be. But as far as like, military strategy or how much money should you raise its army, that's your call. We're going to stay away from it, right? But the emperors tried to get more involved. Like, well, can we maybe make a statement about the Virgin Mary? Can we really get a definitive statement about the divinity of Jesus? Because this is really starting to affect, started to cause fractures within the empire and different things going on. So, your Holy Father, can you maybe say this, promulgate this, right? So they would try to influence every once in a while. And then councils would be called, questions would be asked and answered, and then eventually something would be promulgated, not always to the liking of the emperor, right? Which sometimes cause even more tensions, right, between the church and the state. But over the course of time, especially starting about 4th century on, Rome started being attacked by these outside forces, these like Goths, and Visigoths, and Vandals. Now, all of these people were predominantly Christian, meaning they professed the faith, but maybe they were also different sects of like Arianism or maybe monotheism or monophysitism, or basically took some heresy that maybe was not necessarily promulgated to them correctly, but they would still call themselves, Catholic or Christian, right? And they would come in and take over Rome every once in a while and kind of set up their kingdom, and then another force would come in and take them out. And so eventually, over time, there was kind of a power backing. After Rome was kind of abandoned, it would kind of fell to ruin. The Roman Empire was kind of fractured, and there was no real legitimate authority to take over and rule these areas. Well, the people looked to the only, permanent structure that was the institution that was there, which happened to be the church. And so they would go to the local bishops and be like, "Hey, what do we do? What are we going to do here? Here's some land. Tell us what to do, right? Here's some money. Can you tell us how to do these things, right?" And that was kind of how things were going for a couple hundred years until Charlemagne came about, right? So Charlemagne was a French king. He set the kingdom of basically the first king of France, and he basically dedicated his life to the church. And even to the point where he donated land and titles and money to the Holy Father and the different bishops, right? Who became now secular authorities over these lands and in these areas, right? Separated from the king, but their own separate, like, kind of governmental entity, right? And again, it was an act of charity on the part of, Charlemagne, but also it caused other issues, right? Because, well, what does a bishop know about running a fiefdom, right, or farming, or working land or ranching or whatever else? And so for the most part, there was some peace and harmony, just because, well, there was really no one bothering each other in these circumstances. And then what kind of changed everything was these establishments of monasteries. So in the 8th, 9th century, Franciscans went out, and they Benedictines started going out and Benedictines more, but there's way before the Franciscans, and started to set these monasteries where they would actually be the centers of learning. And they would teach people how to farm and ranch and like beekeep and write and read. And so because of these centers were kind of set up in these different towns and villages, they grew to the point where they became these large cities in Europe, right? Like places like Paris and Frankfurt and London. And, so this kind of spread all throughout Europe. But they were run by the orders, but also there was a king that governed these areas. And what that set up then is this kind of tension where some of these monasteries, they're making a lot of money, right? Because, well, hey, we're getting all these gifts coming in, there's trade going on. Some of these areas came like great banking centers because, well, they were secure. The first monasteries were built like castles. I mean, they were like, huge. And so they seemed like a logical place to kind of for protection when things went wrong, but also there were places to keep your stuff because they were safe. Who's going to ransack a monastery, especially if you're Christian, right? Vikings may have had other ideas about that, but most of the people would just kind of live their life around these areas. And because of that influence and that commerce that was being involved, the secular rulers kind of wanted a part of that, right? So they would start putting taxes on these monasteries, or they start putting we need this land now, eminent domain. Oh, we need this land now because we need to repurpose this for whatever, right? So that caused even more tension, right? So where does the secular authority end and the church begin, right? And vice versa. There's an interesting kind of situation that happened then also in the 11th century. So the 11th century, there was a split between the Eastern and Western Church, right? So Constantinople was set up, as Rome was falling, Constantinople was kind of growing. It was kind of really probably considered the most beautiful city in the world at that time, right? I mean, there's a lot of Greek influence, right? There's kind of a reestablishment of like Greek thought, Greek art. But also there's different ideas that were coming out of Constantinople, which had to be debated over time as well. One such idea was, well, what is the authority of the Pope really all about, right? So in other words, well, first off, who picks the Pope? If the Pope is the head of the church, well, who should pick the Pope? Also, we understand bishops. The Pope is just a bishop. The bishops kind of are in charge of their own dioceses, right? Why should the Pope pick which bishops go where? And so this was kind of being debated even earlier on, but it kind of came to a head in the 11th century and kind of caused a split between the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Holy Father, right? There's a lot of, actually, there was a lot of intrigue going on there too. Part of that was more political. So there was kind of this, whoever was ruling Rome at the time was trying to reach out to the emperor in Constantinople to kind of cause peace. He would actually look to the Pope to kind of go and maybe be a delegate. But also then the emperor, the Roman king kind of didn't really trust the Pope, and that caused some issues. And so there was there was like this constant sort of like reaching out, trying to treaties being made, understanding to come, and then it would be blown up and by shooting each other in the foot in some way, right? On both sides. And that kind of led up to this split in 1054.
1087 is that the year or something?
1054.
1054. Okay.
So at that point, Constantinople, the Patriarch excommunicated the Holy Father. The Holy Father excommunicated the Patriarch of Constantinople, and you set up the Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. Right? There was some, for lack of, I don't know if you could really say like reconciliation, appearances of reconciliation over time, but it really the church never really, really got together and actually did those things, right? So, of course, Constantinople thought that the Holy Father, the Bishop of Rome, was a first among equals, but his authority was just in Rome compared to, and so that started a whole other debate. But what that did then is set up this kind of two other kingdoms who now have these other influences. And a few years later, the Byzantine Empire, which is what it was called Constantinople, was being attacked by this new sect of religious zealots that came out of the Middle East called the Muslims, right? I think at that point they were called the Solomons, but again, this is a theocratic government that was run by a sultan, right, or a muezzin, or they had some secular authority that actually was a religious leader as well. It was started by Muhammad in 622 AD. It has a lot of influence from not only Christianity, but Judaism, as well as Zoroastrianism, which was kind of a worship of celestial bodies. Like in Mecca, for instance, it's thought that the stone that they all kind of march around is actually a meteorite that fell, and they held that sacred because of the king from heaven, kind of thing. So the sect kind of took hold in the Middle East, in North Africa, and then was starting to threaten Europe, especially Constantinople. So Constantinople, if ever been to Istanbul or see where that is, yeah, it's right on. It's on basically a peninsula that separates Turkey from the Middle East. So it's really kind of this. It's on between the Black Sea and I think it's the Mediterranean. And so it's almost kind of like the entrance into Europe from the Middle East, right? So you had to get there either by boat or maybe had a bridge every once in a while, but it was a very heavily fortified city, but also it was a very important city. And so this Muslim sect started conquering areas like the Holy Land and Syria, and encroaching closer and closer into the Byzantine Empire, to the point where they were very close to Constantinople. So the emperor of the Byzantine Empire sent a delegate to Rome saying, "Hey, can we get some help here? This new religion, they've taken over, well, first off, the place where Jesus was born, which is, we probably want to get that back. But also they're causing a great threat to us, right? We may not have a church here anymore unless we do something." Right? And this happened around 1099 AD. So the Holy Father, it's never quite known what he said, but he apparently gave this rousing speech that kind of about going to defend the Holy Land. And really, it was really called a pilgrimage. And said, and Dr. Mann talks about it this way, is at this time, you have these kind of secular rulers, these lords and these knights who were so used to fighting, but then there came this time of peace. Right. And so as they get older, they start realizing, I killed a lot of people. Man, I don't know if I can be forgiven for this stuff. What can I do to actually receive God's mercy? Right. And so it just so happened the Holy Father said, well, hey, you go on this pilgrimage, you get an indulgence, you'll get forgiven your sins. It's just a trip to the Holy Land to go to the Holy Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It just so happens it's actually controlled by Muslims, and so they're going to try and kill you. So you should probably defend yourself, right? And also it's going to help our Eastern brothers and maybe cause some reconciliation because we're really helping them out, right? So it really was considered a good thing, but it wasn't considered to be like a war. It was considered to be a defense of the Byzantine Empire, but also a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. So again, you have this kind of like, where's the secular authorities in all this? Is the church calling for this? Well, the church doesn't have an army, so it's really relying on the secular authorities to do this. And it just so happens all the secular authorities had the means to do it and really had the desire to do it because, well, hey, if this is going to get me to heaven, great, let's do it, right? So the First Crusade actually was very, very successful. It actually went all the way into the Holy Land. It actually recaptured Jerusalem and the holy places. The people, it was ruled by these lords and knights that came from Europe, and a lot of them stayed to kind of establish the kingdom, what they called the Latin kingdom in the Middle East. And so that was actually held for about 150 years, right? And so you had these Catholics who were secular rulers that were ruling these, again with the church. And what's so fascinating, and this, I think a lot of times people misconstrue what the Crusades actually are. Actually, the Christians treated the Muslims and the Jews in those areas better than the Muslims were treating the Christians and the Jews when they were in charge of those areas. And so a lot of this is, Dr. Madden always talks about how you see things like movies and, in media, they kind of look at the Crusades as like this evil war on the holy war, and that's really not what it was.
It's so misunderstood.
Oh, really, right, yeah. And it was really run by the Pope, but it's like, well, no, the Pope didn't have any authority here. he didn't have any armies. He didn't give the order. It wasn't really known what he even said. Now, some people kind of speculate, but apparently after he gave this speech, everyone was screaming out Deus vult, right? So God wills it, right? And so that kind of caused a great, uproar, and people started to go and do it. Now, there were other crusades after that, because after the Latin states were kind of overcome by the Muslims, there was kind of an attempt to bring them back, but they weren't as successful as that first one. Our namesake, for instance, St. Louis, he was a Crusader king. He went on the Fourth Crusade. He got all the way to Egypt, but he was unfortunately captured. The people of France got a huge sum of money, which is also now known as the king's ransom, to get him back. And then he tried to go back again. He died in Alexandria, probably from dysentery. No one really knows for sure. But again, you have this secular king who was leading these things, these kind of sorties or these pilgrimages into the Holy Land to try to regain a foothold and defend it from Muslim invasion. So again, we see this kind of, again, should the church have been involved with that? Yeah, I mean, that was really kind of more of an act of defense, and really was something that was spiritually good for the people. It wasn't directed or guided. A great example of how this kind of was separation was in the Fifth Crusade. There's a group of these French noblemen who got together, and they really wanted to go just so they can like reclaim the Latin states and rule them. Right, so it wasn't necessarily like a good intention of going on the pilgrimage and defending the Holy Land. It was like, we just want to gain more lands. A lot of them weren't actually in a high rank in their family, so they weren't like heirs to these things, and so they were trying to make a name for themselves. Well, the problem was they got to the Mediterranean and they realized they didn't have enough money to get back. So they made this deal with the Doge of Venice to get ships and whatnot. The Doge gave them ships, but then there was actually well, there's a stipulation on that. They had to go and attack one of their enemies first before they did that, which also caused great consternation because the Pope actually condemned it, saying, "Well, this is not a crusade. You're now fighting Christians. That's not good." So because they were all excommunicated, and so after that they said, "Well, let's go for broke," and they decided to attack Constantinople.
Oh my gosh.
And they succeeded. They actually breached the walls of Constantinople and actually overtook it, and even held the emperor hostage until they're actually one of the things they were actually lobbying for was a reunification of the two churches, which was granted. But the problem was, well, you're all excommunicated, and also this is not legitimate. So it was a huge cluster mess. Yeah, it was just ridiculous how it all worked out. And so that was actually one that was condemned by the Holy Father. Because again, the intention was there, it was Christians fighting Christians, it's not what this was to be. And so that again was more of a, well, where's the church end and the secular authority began, right? So another great example of we see this kind of inflation is actually, well, not really, we don't really see it there, but it's actually kind of has been over time kind of put out there as an example of this, but the Inquisition. So the Inquisition actually was an attempt in the 13th century to kind of understand, okay, well, what actually is heresy? So again, we understand this whole idea of church and state. Well, the rulers of Spain, the Spanish Inquisition, were Catholic, right? And they really didn't see the distinction between what the church authority was and what their authority was. They understood that their roles came from God. The church is the God's representative on earth, so whatever the church says, that's what we're going to do. So to the point where laws were established where any heretic would undergo capital punishment, right? The problem with that is you have secular judges who are determining who's a heretic, right? So if they didn't know any, if they would always, so obviously I think the prudent thing would be, well, let's err on the side of caution. If you're a heretic, let's kill you, get out of here, right? So that's kind of what's happening a lot of the times in Spain, especially. So the Holy Father and the bishops, seeing this is not really the best thing, decided to set up ecclesiastical tribunals where the people would go before the tribunal and then they would make the decision based on this tribunal that was established, which became the Inquisition. What's actually fascinating, Dr. Mann talks about this in the class, you might remember this, Sam. They actually probably saved more lives than they actually killed. Because what was happening were people were just being killed left and right because the secular authorities didn't know any better. And so they would just go and kill them. What ended up happening, what they realized was most people just weren't educated in the faith or catechized, whatever that word for, and they just need to either be catechized or they were ignorant or there was something else mentally going on with them they couldn't comprehend. And so they end up actually quitting more than they actually would have killed, right? But even the ones that were killed, the church never put them to death, right? The church was the one basically saying you're dead. What they would say is, well, yeah, this person is promoting heresy. Secular authorities, what do you want to do with them, right? And because there was a secular law saying, well, if you're a heretic, you die, well, then the secular authorities take them and go and kill them, right? But if you look at the numbers before the Inquisition and after, it's like a magnitude of like 100 that were saved rather than were killed, right? Now there was like a lot of question about, well, was there kind of a proselytization going on, especially with like Jewish brothers and sisters? Well, the church was never forcing anyone to get baptized, right? All it would say is, well, yeah, you are promoting heresy against the Catholic Church. Well, I'm Jewish. Oh, okay, well, that makes sense then. So we'll quote you on that grounds, but if you want to convert, you're more than welcome to do that, right? So again, I think we see this idea of the Inquisition is sort of like, boy, the church was trying to just exert their authority and trying to come down on these people and try to proselytize. That's not what it was. And so we maybe ask ourselves, like, how does this happen? Where we kind of get these ideas. Well, a lot of that comes from the Enlightenment. At the time of the Enlightenment, there was a great movement to actually destroy the church. And so they would put these stories out there, and the Crusades was one, the Inquisition was one, Galileo was another one too. That they would say, like, well, here's some examples. Yeah, this is why the church is bad, and this is why we have to just go by pure reason, because reason really should guide us, not faith. Trying to separate faith and reason once again. Because look what the church has done over history in these incidents and what the damage they cause, when in reality it wasn't the church doing these things, or the facts were misconstrued and conflated to the point where that became kind of what we see in the media and daily life and everything else. Right? But again, the church always maintained that separation, especially even in the Inquisition. Like, this is like this, you have your law, okay, fine, but we're telling you these people are not who you say they are. Their accusations are not correct. And the ones that are, well, we're not telling you what to do. We're saying they're heretics. It's up to you as a state to decide what happens there.
And they would say, like, do you recant your
Yeah,
heresy? Right?
exactly.
Like
They would give them ample opportunity.
Right.
Probably the worst example, kind of the worst example of that was actually Joan of Arc. You know, so Joan of Arc actually was given ample opportunity by the English church. Now, the church was never that was never actually recognized as valid by the church. And that's one of the reasons why Joan of Arc was canonized eventually, because this is an illegitimate meat group that was kind of promoting this and kind of that condemned her, right, with no good evidence. But it was the Inquisition in England that was the one that kind of like kept trying to get her to recant. But what they're trying to get her to recant was nothing that was sacrilegious. It was actually purely political, right? You can't. What they're trying to get her to do is recant her allegiance to the Doge, the King of France. And they said, well, she would have these visions and whatever. Well, those were never confirmed or denied that she actually had them or not. And if we're legitimate authority, they probably would assume she probably suffers from some mental illness, if anything. But especially since the visions were not anything that was teaching her anything that was, or telling her anything that was actually contrary to the faith. So it was, yeah, it was kind of a sham. And you can say, well, that was really bad. Yeah, it was. But the church never actually affirmed that that was actually a good thing. It actually condemned it, right? Problem is, it was after the fact, because, well, we see it all over the place. There's stuff that goes on in different places that, well, the Pope doesn't know about. I mean, we just, a good example of that recently is what, I guess you all have seen Nancy Pelosi went to the Vatican recently, and she received communion from a priest. Now, what was being promulgated? Oh, they're supposed to get communion from the Holy Father. He allowed. Well, he first off wasn't serving communion. He probably didn't even know she was there, for that matter. And the priest that was serving didn't probably know who she was. And so again, we see that. I mean, that's kind of maybe what happened here with Joan of Arc. It was like, well, I don't know what's going on. You got your own place going on. So that's one of kind of the crazy and wonderful things about the ecclesiology of the church, is that when it comes to these pastoral matters, the bishop in their particular diocese have so much authority. Right? The role of the Pope and the Holy Father is actually to protect, defend, and promulgate the faith of the church, right? The universal teachings. And he has authority within his own diocese in Rome for his full authority. But the Holy Father can't come here to St. Louis and tell Archbishop, there's Father Madden, I think you want to move him. He's not doing so great over there, right? He has no authority to do that. Or say, I'm going to go ahead and move Father Madden. Well, Holy Father, you can't. Right? That's not your purview.
We're glad you can't.
Thank you. All the heresy I've preached, right? But so yeah, and that's what we see probably all throughout, and again, that's this understanding of the church's teaching when it comes to solidarity and subsidiarity. We have solidarity in the teachings of the church and the fundamental dogmas, but when it comes to actually how that's applied and what's being done, that's up to the local bishop to determine how that happens, and even to a more modular degree, the pastor of the church. Right? The pastor has a great authority within his boundary. That's always how the church is operated. And it's good reason, because we understand that people here in St. Louis may be different than people in Chicago, right? What's maybe a priority over there may not be a priority here, and vice versa.
But he still appoints all the bishops, though.
He does.
Okay.
Mhm.
Does he know, like, how does he know all these bishops? Or is there, no, he doesn't.
He met a few. Part of that, he relies on people he does know. So,
Okay.
let's say there was an open see here in the Midwest somewhere. He probably would talk to certain cardinals and bishops that he knows that are from this area. So, maybe Cardinal Supich, right? Maybe if it was specifically for St. Louis or maybe one of the cancers from St. Louis, I would imagine you talk to Cardinal Nolan.
Mhm.
Who is this guy? How is he? What, what can you do? Can you do it? Right, that kind of thing. And from there, we probably make a decision whether yes or no. Right. Typically, what happens when there's especially when a bishop gets ordained, there's what they call triumvirate, right? So there are 3 names that are submitted by a metropolitan or a group of bishops for a particular see, and that's submitted to the congregation of bishops. They review it, they go to the Holy Father and say, oh, here's what we recommend, what do you want to do? And then he may make some further determination and say, yeah, that's fine or whatever, right? But it's always 3 names are submitted, right? And then if that person's picked, they would call that man and say, hey, the Holy Father wants to be a bishop here in this diocese. Maybe take some time, pray about it, and let us know what you want to do.
So they do have a choice if they want to take it or not.
They certainly do.
Okay.
Now, some may say, would be a career limiting move if you say no. Yeah, probably would be. But also, there's a level of like, the other question is, well, what kind of obedience is? I mean, when you pledge obedience, that's also to the Holy Father. And so, could you say no? Yeah, I mean, you could, but that is a good question, right? I mean, well, I have obedience to the Holy Father. Yeah, I do. Okay, well, he's asking me to do this, so now that's different than telling him to do. I could say maybe that's the distinction, but that's why I pray. I just never get asked. Let's all pray for that. But we see this all throughout history, that there's always been kind of, again, whenever there's been kind of this ruling by the church, it's always been thrust into it. Finally, the last thing we will talk about tonight, unless there are any questions, there was a situation in Italy around the 1870s, which the establishment of what we may call the Papal States, right? That was an attempt by the secular leaders to kind of pacify the church in certain things. And that kind of even led into the turn of the century in some of the world wars, where to the point where even Mussolini ended up isolating the Holy Father just the Vatican City. That's why the Vatican City was established. It was basically meant to put the Holy Father under house arrest, right, during World War II. Before that, there was these papal states that were given and then taken away and then given back and taken away. So because the church kind of accepted them more out of the end of a rifle, typically in those situations, because they didn't really want them, right? With that came like the Swiss Guard, right? So the Pope has an army. All right, again, I didn't want this, but these all kind of influence secular authorities who really, for the Pope's protection, is the way they usually put it, that they want these guards to be around. It's like, okay, and that's been kind of for the last couple hundred years. The Swiss Guard has been kind of present in Vatican City. Actually started back even with the Vandals, who came from Switzerland. They kind of dedicated themselves to like protecting the Holy Father, and that kind of morphed that into the Swiss Guard. But yeah, so but the Holy Father's never used the army for any type of thing other than defense. But even then, how much does that really happen? So again, whenever this has been thrust upon the church, they've always been kind of reluctant to actually take responsibility for these things because they recognize this shouldn't be the case. Which then also now brings us to the United States. I mean, so we have this tradition, right? We won't find in the Constitution or even in the Declaration of Independence the separation of church and state. That was actually from a letter to the Danbury Baptists from Thomas Jefferson, because they were kind of getting more clarification. Like, well, what does that mean? What does it mean for the church? Freedom of religion. How do we do that? And the intention of Thomas Jefferson was really kind of the same as the church. They didn't want a state religion to be established because they didn't want the faith being tarnished or influenced by secular authority, right? They want people to worship the way they felt called by God to worship. And they've seen kind of how this happened in Europe and other places, especially with the Church of England and these other places that were kind of more became secularized. And they didn't want that in the United States. So again, this is a tradition of the United States. It's not anything that's in law. The freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment is meant that we can worship any way we want and not be influenced by the state. That was the purpose of it. Which, funny enough, was the same approach the church made back in the 4th century.
Okay.
So it's kind of fascinating. And tell you the truth, that was also kind of one of the things that when there was actually a heresy established in the founding United States called Americanism. The big fear was that if the people start going towards this kind of ruling by the people, how that may influence the church, right? Because up at that point, most of the rulers in the European kingdoms were all Catholic. And so when the church promulgates something, well, as a Catholic, you have to assent to this. That doesn't necessarily influence, it should influence how you rule. But also there's a level of informed people are making these decisions, right? And so the fear in the United States was, well, okay, if everyone can vote, does everyone have an understanding of the issues? And so, well, is that going to maybe seep into the church where people are now coming with dogma and influencing the church in that way, where they have no understanding or knowledge of what that implications are? Now that was quickly kind of subsided and realized, but I mean, that is an interesting question in the United States. I mean, we look at people that vote. Is everyone that votes really, do they really know the issues or what's at stake with a lot of the issues? That's one of the beauties of having democracy is that everyone does have to say, but also that's also one of the challenges, one of the worries, because, well, should you?
Yeah.
So that was something that the church was kind of concerned about at the very beginning of the revolution. But then can understand. I think part of that was there's recognition that human reason will always come through, right? That God is always going to provide in those circumstances too. Faith is always going to be guided, supported by reason, and reasons should be guided by faith. And that's funny enough. That's actually what the founders also, the United States also believed too. So yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say, there's been a lot of podcasts been talking about this very topic for the US and talking about how, getting back to how the fact that the country is a Judeo-Christian country.
Yeah.
And was established with that, with all the founders, every one of those founding fathers was Christian, one Catholic, they were all Christian. Like Charles. Carol.
Yeah.
And anyway, I was listening to a lot of things yesterday. It was interesting because I was reading something about the folding of the flag. You know how they do it? Funerals? For each time they fold the flag 13 times. There's a prayer that they say, or like a
Oh, I didn't know that.
They have. I listed that there's 13, and they're all based on God and faith. And it's like, wow,
Yeah.
we don't appreciate that enough in this country. The fact that those are our roots.
Right.
They took out prayer in school in the 60s.
Yeah.
It kind of started with that.
No, I mean, it's always a challenge. I mean, because again, the question still remains: where does the secular authority as the church begin? And I think that I think we have to look back to the founding fathers in the United States to see. Well, the idea was that the church would be the principles of the American idea were founded on moral people, and the people that established the United States understood that. Well, the church is providing that direction when it comes to morality. And so if people are not religious, that could be a problem because you can enact laws that were just, well, based on your whim and not really have any ground in reason or logic or faith. In which case, well, that's why maybe abortion could be legal up until, birth, or 2 men and 2 women could get married in the eyes of the secular authorities, or if you're becoming a burden on your family, let's just go ahead and give you a pill that you lets you fall asleep and pass away, or you know, death row inmates, right? I mean, like, or let's open our borders to anyone who wants to come in and leave ourselves open to attack, or even flood the system where we can't provide for them. Yeah, those are problems, and they have moral implications. And the founding fathers were always would state that, well, yeah, their guidance should come from the moral principles of our faith, of our religion. So if that's not happening, what does that mean?
So I guess is the current stance or whatever that like religious principles ideally would influence governmental decisions, but completely no like administrative
Right.
position.
Yeah, so I think the idea there is like when it comes to maybe like amoral issues. Okay, so how much should we charge on taxes to build roads and provide for a police force and army? Relatively immoral, right? Because a lot of that's more like, well, how much do we have? How much do we need? And so let's just tax whatever that may be, right? Now there could be some more implications if you tax more, and then the key question, well, where's that money going then, right? But even certain things like, okay, well, appointing of judges, like, okay, well, it's probably good to have judges, but you know who they are, I don't know who should make that decision, right? Even kind of enacting certain laws. I mean, like, okay, like traffic lights. All right, well, green means go, red means stop. Great. That has no real implication on the faith whatsoever, right? I mean, so there's certain things that they're done by the federal government or the state government or just secular rulers that would have really no moral implication or be considered amoral in general. I mean, the problem, the issue at hand would be when we talk about things like laws. Laws are only moral or immoral depending on how they're applied and who's doing them, right? So in other words, if you were to enact a law that says, yeah, you know what, if you feel like killing your neighbor, go for it. Well, I mean, the church would be like, well, there seems like there's something wrong about that because, well, you should be, self-defense is one thing, but if you're just saying, my neighbor's throwing grass clippings on my lawn, I should shoot him. That doesn't seem like a reasonable thing to do, nor is it moral, right? Because doing unto others, you wouldn't be doing to you. Which is actually more of a rational argument than it is really a religious argument. So because of that, the nature of the law, the church could say that's immoral, that should not be followed, right? And for the most part, there's a few of those, like when it comes to maybe like abortion laws, like allowing, abortion up to the moment of birth. There should be abhorrent. Now, the church would say that someone should not do that, even if the law's in the books, right? That's one thing about that particular law is it's an allowance, it's not actually a requirement. And so we as churches say, even though that law's in the books, a good Catholic or a good Christian should not do that, right? For obvious reasons. Now, if the law were to be, oh no, you have to at least have, if you have 2 kids, that's your limit, and then anything after that, you're going to have to worship. Oh, no, of course not. We would say that's unjust. That should not be followed by anybody, and we would do everything we could to kind of overturn that law, right? So there is limitations on those things, and the part of it's the nature of the law, but also the influence the church really has in these situations on the agents themselves that are doing them, right? So there really comes to a head. Oftentimes, we're talking about politicians, those that actually put laws, enforce or actually enact laws. What is the role of a Catholic politician in our government that where the separation of church and state comes into play? And I mean, the catechism actually is very clear about this. It says that Catholic politicians should follow their conscience that is informed by the church and the church's teaching. And in situations where they can't, the best thing they should probably do is just refrain. All right. So in other words, if there's a law that's coming up in the House of Representatives that is trying to push abortion to past birth, infanticide, let's say, whatever, right? Which there's a few of them out there, right? What the catechism say that the role of the Catholic politician, if they know that they're not, that this is going to pass and they have no control over it, is just not vote.
Instead of even voting no, would voting no be more?
They could, but part of that could be though too, is there's also like a rationale in that, would voting no get me kicked out? Or would it lead to me being, not elected in the next term, where I can actually do some good in this case? Right, so there are political questions that are rational to ask about those things. So the church is not, ignorant of those things. But to say, yes, I am for this bill to actually expand abortion to past birth, as a Catholic would be sinful, immoral, and important. Where maybe the best you can do, rationally speaking, prudentially speaking, is just say, I'm going to abstain for this vote. You can do that as a Catholic politician. So yeah, it's and there's like most of the laws we see in the United States are relatively immoral, right? There's really no, again, it depends more on the agent that's doing them or following them than it would be actually the law itself, right? So I'd say the majority of them are that way, and so the church would not have any say. It's like, yeah, whatever, that sounds whatever you want to do, whatever seems prudential in that respect.
A lot of the problems come through the administrative state where they implement and support things financially that they
Yeah.
shouldn't,
Yeah, and that's a problem. But I mean, when it comes to the church, I mean, the way the United States wants to run their government, it's not really a moral thing, right? So if the United States comes tomorrow and says, you know what, I think we're just going to put all our power under the president, we're going to abolish the judicial and the legislative branch. Okay. So the church really has no really say in that because it's not really something that affects them at all. Right. Now you say prudentially, from a prudential, like from the virtue of prudence, is that the smartest thing or the wisest thing to do? Probably not, but it wouldn't necessarily be sinful to say we're just going to combine all our power to this one person. Right. Or immoral to say that. And that's kind of where that's where the separation would lie.
The weird thing about it to me is we've gotten to a state where somebody are just ignoring natural law, even outside of the church. Like common sense, you don't kill your baby, right? Natural law,
Yeah, and I think part of that too is there's, when we talk about the moral act, we also have to look at the action itself, definitely the intention or the end, right? What the actual purpose is, and then what the circumstances are. And only one of those needs to be bad for it to be an immoral act, right? All of them have to be good to be actually a moral action. When it comes to things like abortion, and we have to make the distinction between that and something that's sinful too, right? Sinfulness is always subjective. It's always based on the person's individual conscience. So there are factors like, well, is it really well formed? Is there a level of compulsion, right? That's maybe involved with this that maybe didn't allow you to make the best decision. And when it comes to things like abortion, I mean, I think a lot of it stems from the fact that some people have had some experience with it, that it comes from a kind of a false sense of compassion. So in other words, if my sister got an abortion, and I love my sister and I want to help her and support her, I may be more prone to say what she did was fine. It's for her mental health. It was better for her emotional health. She was scared and alone, and there was a lot of factors that went into her and fear that was driving that. And because of that, she made this decision. Now maybe that wouldn't have been the best decision, but I want to support her in her decision because I know what was going into that fact. Those factors are going into that decision. And I want to love my sister. And so that almost takes over as this false sense of compassion to say, because of this circumstance, it should be fine for everybody. Well, that's not true, right? And even for your sister, you say, well, yeah, maybe the culpability may be far reduced because of the situation she was in. I'm not going to say it wasn't. I don't know. But I can still say that the taking the life of an innocent human being is wrong, right? Regardless of the circumstances. And I'm sorry your sister went through that. And if she needs to talk or wants healing, we can do that for her. And for you. But if you want me to say that what your sister did was right, well, I can't. I mean, I think that's primarily what happens with a lot of these things. I mean, we see the same thing going on with gay marriage. You know, many of us in our families have people experience same-sex attraction, and I would even say even the point where maybe many people experience this, they may even love the partner they're with. They have a great affection for that person. Okay, I'm not going to deny that. But if you're telling me that those two people are now engaged in a bond of holy matrimony, I can't say that.
Do you think most Catholic politicians know about what the catechism says? Because I did not know that.
Well, you know, it's interesting. And I always, Mary Beth, I'm trouble when I say this. I always assume charitably when it comes to these things, right?
He does.
I want to assume that it's either ignorance or a false sense of compassion. I think that's pretty sometimes the best things you can actually assume. When it comes to these things, I know, like, for instance, I've heard Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi say things like, when it comes to things like abortion, like, oh, well, you know, Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, they never really said when the soul entered the body. They said they didn't know. And it's true. If you go back and read Augustine's treatise on marriage, and if you go back and read Thomas Aquinas, the Summa, they make some statements that were kind of ambiguous to the point where, like, they would say, yeah, you know, like Augustine thought that it took like 30 days for the sperm to reach the ovum, right? Well, and the reason to be is because Thomas, I think, even said shorter than that, but also like even say that when the soul enters the body, that may not be for another 3 months. And the reason they said that is because what is evidence of a soul is movement, right? And so you don't necessarily see a woman showing until maybe 2 months, which indicates, oh, there's a soul there. There's a movement going on. Now, Augustine and St. Thomas didn't have the privilege of having scientific knowledge of these things to make determinations. Right. So I think based on that, they would say, yeah, well, no, of course, at the moment of conception that happens because there is movement and growth, even before that. But also what they say in those documents is that even if you say the soul didn't enter the body until this time, it would still be wrong to stop that natural movement because there's potential for a human being to exist. So regardless, it's wrong. Even if the soul doesn't enter the body at that moment, because you're stopping that natural process that's ordained by God to bring about human life. So I've heard them say these things about, it's like, yeah, but you're not reading the entire book then. But also, I understand your argument, but that's not only anti-scientific, but it's also anti-philosophical and anti-theological, because even in those same writings, Thomas and Augustine still say, this isn't good.
Right.
And that goes back, I mean, that even goes back to the Didache, which was written in the 1st century, 2nd century, right? It's always been a problem. So the Didache, for those who don't know, it's a document that was written in the 2nd century. It was thought to be the teachings of the apostles. Now, some may say it actually came after the last apostle died, so that may not necessarily got attributed to the apostles, but in it has a lot of things in it that were very clear that were taught by Jesus. And one of those things was abortion is illegitimate. It's completely illicit and immoral. Specifically. And because a lot of our Protestant brothers and sisters go back, even some Catholics may go back and say, where does it say abortion in the Bible? Yeah, okay, there's no actual word abortion in the Bible. I'll give you that. But it does say, thou shalt not kill. And before I knit you together in the mother womb, I knew you. And it has other treatises on the marital act and all these other things. So even though it doesn't specifically say that, I think you can logically come to the conclusion that Jesus doesn't want babies to be killed in the womb.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think it does. I mean, to me, it seems pretty reasonable.
Yeah.
But I think the issue we're seeing though with a lot of people is it's not a rational argument they're making. It's more of a emotional one because of the experience that they have with it. And who knows? Maybe Nancy Pelosi. I don't know. Maybe Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi have had some experience with it in some way. Maybe. I don't know. But I think part of that is we have to let them. They have to understand is that mercy always can be given, healing can always be given. But objectively speaking, you can't say that these things are right.
I think it's confusing a lot of the members of the church. That's the sad part.
Well, again, because again, church and state, maybe coming back, we're talking about here. That's one of I think the struggles of being a bishop. Because we talked about how the bishop has a lot of authority within their diocese. So Archbishop Cordileone had made a statement that basically put Nancy Pelosi under what we call interdict, right? So she is removed from receiving the sacrament of the Eucharist at Mass in the Archdiocese of San Francisco. Okay, why haven't other bishops done this?
Amen.
Such as Cardinal Wilton Gregory, who is the Archbishop of Washington, D.C. Well, and I think the answer to that is we kind of point to the actual letter the Archbishop wrote when it came to this issue. He said he was basing this on multitude of dialogue he's had with her, with the Speaker of the House, as well as obstinate. It seems like there's some clarity, but then actions and words are said which are contrary to that conversation. And so because of that, he's made this decision. So it's evident that he's been trying to reach out and trying to actually, trying to have a dialogue. And that's been being rejected or dismissed or whatever. Maybe Cardinal Gregory has been trying to do the same, but just hasn't had as much opportunity as Archbishop Cordileone. That would be my charitable interpretation. Where's the line for what Cardinal Gregory? I don't know. Only Cardinal Gregory knows that, right? Cardinal Gregory's made statements in the past about how, again, upholding the teaching of the church when it comes to life, other issues. So he's not ignorant to the fact, but maybe he's still trying to dialogue, and that takes time.
Yeah, because Propati has against.
Oh yeah, several,
Yeah.
and especially the state senators and the national leaders from
There's
Illinois.
a lot of them. The guy from Hawaii, there's a senator from Hawaii.
I know there's I don't know, I'm not sure.
You mean those people are not receiving communion?
Pardon?
You mean those people aren't receiving communion in their?
They would put in the same situation as under interdict by their particular bishops. So, and the problem with politicians is they have what the canon law considers quasi domicile, right? So what that means is they have separate places of residence. So just because one bishop says one thing in that particular diocese, well, they could go somewhere else and,
Yeah, see, that's where the American bishops.
Well, again, I think it's kind of tough, Mary Beth, because you could say, well, shouldn't they be collegial in this aspect and actually kind of be one front? Yeah, I mean, you could make the argument.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, if I were to make a statement without having any knowledge of it, what's going on, well, that could also come back to haunt me and bite me too, right? There's a line between being pastoral and also upholding the teaching of the church. And we should be, there shouldn't be, but sometimes there is. And that's one of the jobs of the bishop, make that judgment. And that's again why I pray I never asked to become a bishop, because that is such a difficult position to be in. I don't envy them. I pray for them. I understand the criticism. I think it's sometimes very legitimate, but I can't judge these things because I don't know everything that's going on with them.
I guess I just have a hard time understanding why. I mean, like, because I was reading the comments and the ones that supported Cordileone, and as I calculated, it was about 5% of all the U.S. bishops that said something in support of him. I thought 5%. That's really kind of sad.
Yeah, but again, part of this is the question I think sometimes at hand is, this is my battle. So like for instance, if let's say Nancy Pelosi came here to St. Louis,
And she showed up here. at
And
St.
she'll hear St.
Peter's.
Gabriel, right?
And you were,
And she was a German.
Right.
yeah,
So what is my responsibility as the priest in that respect?
yeah,
Well, the Archbishop, provided the Archbishop hasn't said anything publicly,
Right.
my obligation is to try to have a conversation with her before her mass
Prior.
starts. You know, give her an opportunity to maybe receive the sacrament of confession if she hasn't already, right? Or even ask her, hey, have you done confession? You know, because I have a responsibility to uphold the dignity and respect of the Eucharist, right? And also her soul.
mhm,
So now barring that, if she were to come up and present herself for communion, provided the Archbishop has not said anything, I'd have to assume charitably, maybe she's received the sacrament, maybe she hasn't had a chance to actually publicly denounce these things. But if I'll have to assume that she's in a state to receive.
It'd be really awkward to have no preparation and suddenly you're presented with this and to think, am I really gonna not offer this to you? Like,
Well, I mean,
that would be-
there have been in the past, certain, like, I know Archbishop Burke has made statements in the past that certain politicians are here.
John Kerry, I
Yeah,
think it
Kerry
was,
is one of
yeah.
them. And so, but barring that though, yeah, there is a level of prudence involved with distribution of the Eucharist and also like, well, okay, what is the most charitable thing I can assume here? And part of that too, when it comes to the reception is up to the recipient to make those determinations too,
that's true.
right? I mean, if you're presenting yourself, I'd have to assume, provided I haven't seen anything there then,
Mhm.
right? That you did something immoral, that you're in a state to receive. Yeah, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, it's now. Let's say she came in like after the consecration or something. Well, that's a little different. I mean, actually, I actually had a little more ammo there. I can actually, hey, I saw you came in late. Do you think you can go back and watch the stream, or you know, otherwise I can't give you the Eucharist, right? Because you should be there for the sacrifice. So I can make other arguments maybe in that respect. But she's there on time. Maybe she strolls in right before we process in, sits down, goes through the mass, comes up to receive, and I have to assume that she's in a state to receive.
In past times, centuries past, you know, if withholding the Eucharist was a common thing, did it come up like it seems to be coming up now?
Well, I don't know about withholding Eucharist, but excommunication I think was a little more common. But part of that though, right? That was really more a public statement for public figures. So when you saw excommunication, it was more in the concept of like a king or a queen or even a religious bishop or some other clergy that was not upholding the teaching of the church. It was to be very explicitly clear. Right? And we have to understand excommunication is not the excommunication happened. You're the one that excommunicates yourself. All the bishop does is declare what actually is a reality, right?
From the actions that person has
Right,
done.
right.
Okay.
So in other words, if I don't know, there's a recent one. The only reason I know about this because a friend of mine that I worked with was a parishioner at this parish, but the priest there apparently was in, I don't know. He apparently hired these two women to come and do some very illicit things in the church on the altar
With him.
with him.
Oh.
Now, I don't know if he was actually excommunicated. I don't know. But the bishop would be well within his rights to declare that because of that action. Right? He's the one that did it. The bishop is just declaring a reality. Now, how does one get out of that state? Well, confession. You know, they have to repent, right? And I would say a majority of the times excommunication is declared, repentance happens pretty almost right away, with certain exceptions. Henry VIII, for instance, Luther, some other, these other people. But part of that's a level of obstinance that's involved, right?
So question
Yeah.
about that. So if somebody like, Pelosi and Biden had both been horrendously, explicitly calling for abortion at all levels,
Mhm.
and just like gangbusters, the murdering of innocent
Right.
children up to the time of birth, and in
Right.
some cases, some states are even a week after.
Yeah.
To me, that's just out and out murder. To me, in my mind, as I look at it, I feel like all those people are basically excommunicated themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think
And they're
that's could be
faking
true.
it with their Catholicism.
I mean, you could be right. I mean, part of the struggles here too is, okay, well, in times past, if a king were excommunicated, it became very obvious. And typically, the reason that the king would want to repent right away is because that their authority would be taken away from them. They've lost the confidence of their people they're serving.
Right.
They've lost, these in the eyes of the exterior things have been really problematic, right? What's a challenge here in the United States is with these situations is, okay, let's say Archbishop Cornelius or Archbishop Gregory, for instance, came out and said, yeah, you know what, Biden, Pelosi, you're excommunicated. Right? That always becomes a political football, right? Because, oh, look at the big bad church now.
I'm not saying they should be, but I'm saying in my,
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, like, as a bishop, though, you kind of have to go through this calculus in some way, right? So would we lose people because this has been declared for these two politicians? Would people will leave the faith because of it, which wouldn't be good? Or do we trust that people actually are reasonable in their understanding and actually understand the faith to the point where they realize this is not what the church teaches and ignore them? Those are two legitimate prudential, conclusions you can make, right? I think it'd be hard pressed to say that anyone would say that the Catholic Church promotes abortion. I just think that's just something that even your most staunch atheist would say, yeah, that's something the church is uphold. Right. So the calculus here is, okay, do we excommunicate this person, which also could alienate a lot of people? Or do we trust that people understand what the church teaching is? And maybe just see these people as charlatans and people that are kind of damning themselves in some way. In which case, which is the most beneficial?
I think another thing, like another consequence could be if there's some big public excommunication, that would have people that maybe at some point later in life would be open to joining the church, kind of like say, you know what, and push them away further. So
It could be.
It closes off the chance later.
Right.
And that would be a really terrible thing.
Now, a lot of these are also what it could have should. I mean, they really are. They're really just more hypothetical. But those are legitimate concerns. And so it's one of these things where, yeah, how does this impact? I mean, unfortunately, yeah. Okay, first off, are we upholding the truth? I think we said the church is, right? Their teaching is very clear about that. Whether Catholics promote that or not, well, part of that is an act of free will, and all we can really do is say we can try to teach and direct and guide as best we can. But again, it comes out, where's that line then? Because also we want to be open to repentance and forgiveness for them too.
Right.
Yeah.
And would also say you're excommunicated, would that alienate them even further? It's tough.
Well, like I said, I'm not saying that the church should excommunicate them, but in my feeling.
Yeah, you're right.
They've separated.
In a way,
themselves.
they probably have. Yeah, in a way, they probably have. Maybe they have. But part of that too is just, I mean, it's.
And they've also
Yeah.
found, honestly, they've also probably found some priests that say, that's okay.
Yeah, and again, I mean, it's one of these things where, like,
Not many, but there are.
where
some.
is there an olive branch trying to be without knowing the situations, I can't say for sure. And I don't know, because like I would want to assume that whoever priest they're going to, or whatever church they're going to receive the sacraments, they're trying to have this conversation with them in some way. They're trying to guide them in some way. And maybe, or maybe just one of these things where, I mean, another factor to keep in mind here, might be banned from YouTube on this or
Yeah,
Facebook, but I mean, when it comes to like with the president, is his mental faculties all there? I mean, if you're suffering from certain, aspects of, these things, well, are you really culpable in these situations either?
Lifelong practice, probably.
Yeah, I mean, it's there's a lot of factors.
You're more
right?
charitable than I am, Father.
Well, I guess I'm in the right profession then.
Speaker is looking for.
What?
I guess I'm in the right profession then.
Well, this is, okay, I voted one day and came out and there was a Catholic politician standing there and this person said to me, I hope you voted for me. And I said, no, I did not. I said, because you believe in abortion. And she goes, oh, this person said, no, I don't believe in abortion. That's the feeling of my constituents.
Yeah,
And I thought,
yeah.
okay, this is just,
Well, in some ways, actually, that argument comes back from Al Smith in the 1920s. So if anyone doesn't know Al Smith, he ran for president against Woodrow Wilson. And it was coming at a time where there was kind of a rise in anti-Catholicism in the United States. And he was asked very bluntly by some of the news people, well, can you separate, your belief from the Catholic teaching from what was necessary as the president? Meaning, if it came down to decisions being made based on, what the church says and compared to what the people say, which would you choose? And he said something to the effect of, sure, yes, I can make those distinctions, and my faith does not influence my secular or my role as president or whatever it may be. Now, that's a very good political thing to say, but from a moral and religious standpoint, that's horrible to say. Because how could it not?
no.
Right? How can your influence of your conscience not affect how you make decisions? Right? Funny enough, that was the same thing that John F. Kennedy said back in the 60s. And so you see this kind of promulgation of that in many ways in our Catholic political sphere. And the same point was like, well, yeah, no, I don't personally uphold these things, but I'm not representing myself, I'm representing the people who elect me, and if they want this. But even the Kennedy is very clear about that though too. You are a moral agent. Especially if you're in a position of authority, you have even more responsibility to uphold morality.
Even more.
Right? Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. And so,
Yeah.
as a matter of fact, I don't know if I would want someone representing me who doesn't enact what they believe.
Mhm.
Right? Because that you're separating yourself in some way from your human side.
Mhm.
It's almost like a duality going on, and we don't want that. I don't want that for anybody.
No.
It's like the first time I heard somebody say, and it shocked me, it's a couple of years ago. I had not heard it. It was from somebody who goes to mass faithfully and said, oh, I'm just having a conversation with them. Oh, I'm not against abortion, but I'm pro-choice. And it was like,
Yeah.
the first time I heard it, it was like, come again?
Well, I mean, and here's the thing. I mean, and I can see. I am too. I mean, because here's what I mean about that is, yeah, you have the choice of engaging in an action that brings about children or not.
She meant that,
Okay, yeah, but
right.
I mean, again, when you talk about circumstances of like, rape and incest, even though those are very, very, very small, statistically percentages, again, it still comes down to, well, does that innocent life need to bear the consequences of a sinful action? That's really at the heart of that discussion.
Right.
But now, and no one's saying that woman has to raise that child and live with the child.
Adoption, right.
There are options,
Right.
Yes.
and I think that's part of the problem is, even with the whole thing with Roe v. Wade, part of that is just a lack of understanding of what the political process is. Roe v. Wade did not abolish abortion in this country, unfortunately. all it did was say the states now have the right to
Right.
determine that.
Mhm.
I don't understand what's wrong about that.
These young people don't understand. I think they're just on the bandwagon to be out there with everybody.
Yeah, it could
I
be.
hate to say that.
No, some of them too are they're just psycho crazy that that's what they want at all levels and all.
Right.
I mean, they've just gone,
I think
just nuts.
it's just basically they don't see it as a child.
Right.
So it's not
They
a, it's
dehumanize
not
it.
the dilemma. And it's also like hearing the hysterical outcry that's like, wow, they can't even imagine that, you have a responsibility here. Like that's not even part of the thinking. So it's kind of like a failure of imagination, maybe, of like, other people, I don't know what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I think there's some truth there. I mean, when we talk about, we really live in a very relativistic society.
Yeah.
And I think that's at the heart of this too, is like, well, what's good for you may not be good for me. Yeah, well, maybe you're in a circumstance where you have this child, raise a child, and okay, good, right, great, good for you. I'm not,
Mhm.
and so that's different than for me now.
Even when you take God out of the equation.
Oh, I don't think it's just even God, I think it's just reason.
That's
I mean,
true.
I mean, of course, reason comes from
Right,
God, but I
right.
mean, but in this circumstance, like,
Right.
okay, well, yeah, well, no one's asking you to raise the child and, do these things. And oh, by the way, we have these resources over here to help you
Mhm.
to give birth to the child if there's financial issues, but also to find someone that will raise this child
Right.
for you. That you don't have to be part of it, you don't want to.
Yeah.
But this, whether you get a child or not, it's a living being.
Mhm.
And so why should this have to be condemned for the consequences that happen to you? And again, even if there are horrible circumstances, I'm empathetic and sympathetic to that.
Oh, sure.
It shouldn't have, I'm sorry it happened, but it
Right.
did. And so you can either try to make some good come from this or compound the evil that happened to you.
Mhm.
So church and state, there we go. That's how it goes. Yeah, perfect. Any questions about anything we talked about?
Always learn a lot.
Well,
Thank
praise
you,
God.
thank you.
It
Great.
was a nice walk through history.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
important. I mean, it really comes down to the reason here is that there's the church always recognizes that there should be these separate entities because even though maybe the church has some influence on the people that are governing from a moral standpoint, that there shouldn't be an influence from the other way around. And so it's really a protection of the church when it comes to these separations, right? And certain things the church shouldn't have any say in. When it comes to certain aspects. So that's really the reason why that's always been upheld by the church. Good.
Thank
All
you.
right, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Have a good night, guys.
2,000 years and 2 hours.
Yeah.